My name is Stella. I'm 45 years old, living with my husband Richard and our two children in the suburbs of Seattle. For years, I tried to keep our family whole, sacrificing every personal joy just to preserve peace at home. But right in the middle of our Christmas dinner, with cheerful music playing and lights glowing, my life shattered with just a few cold words from the man I called my husband. After this holiday, I'm selling this house. I need the money to start a new life with the woman I truly love. The wine glasses froze midair. Ethan and Grace sat in silence, while our relatives exchanged stunned looks. The warm room instantly became a stage for betrayal. Richard stood tall, like a victor, completely indifferent to the devastated faces around the table. And I smiled. Quietly, I reached into my handbag beside the chair, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and placed it right in front of my husband. His arrogant expression turned pale in an instant. Every eye turned to us, the air so tense it was hard to breathe. Have you ever witnessed betrayal right before your eyes? What would you do if one day your husband declared he would sell your house to fund his mistress? Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, hit like and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you will show you that sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon of all. As Richard's eyes darted away at the dinner table, I saw shock ripple through everyone around us. But in my mind, memories came flooding back. Our suburban Seattle home had once been my dream when I was young. A quiet neighborhood lined with red maple trees every fall, the place I believed our children would grow up surrounded by love and protection. I spent years building every little corner, from the rose garden I tended every morning to the kitchen that always glowed with light at dinner. Richard was 3 years older than me, a successful financial director in the eyes of others. He walked into boardrooms with the kind of confidence people admired, but at home, that gaze grew colder by the day. I used to stand beside him at company events, proud to believe we were a solid couple. But over time, I only saw a husband who grew more distant, retreating into his own world. Ethan, our eldest, had just graduated from college. He carried a creative spirit and was working to build a small tech startup. I saw his determination, but I also worried about the struggles ahead. Ethan didn't speak much, yet whenever he looked at me, his eyes carried trust. He sensed something in our home wasn't whole anymore. Grace, our youngest, 20 years old, was studying law. She inherited her father's sharpness, but her heart was far more fragile. In her late-night calls from the dorm, she often spoke about the pressure of school. I listened closely to every word. She still believed in her father, believing Richard only needed more time. I couldn't break that trust even though I felt the growing distance between me and my husband. I once believed marriage only needed love and patience. I turned down promotions, gave up personal dreams, and spent my youth raising our children and standing by my husband. In the early days, Richard used to bring me flowers, smile as he pulled out a chair at dinner. Now, the room once filled with laughter was nothing but silence. I kept trying to hold our home together. I set the dinner table every night, waited for Richard to come home, so our children would believe the family was still intact. On nights when it was only the three of us, I forced a smile, hiding the emptiness inside. Once Ethan asked me, "Mom, is something wrong with Dad? He seems so different." All I could say was, "Your father's just busy." Grace always insisted, "Don't worry, Mom, I believe Dad still loves you." Those words cut into my heart like knives. I looked at our wedding photo on the wall, the image of a radiant couple, and wondered when that man had disappeared. I never told anyone. I didn't complain to friends. I buried the pain in work, in meals, in the garden. I thought if I stayed patient, if I loved enough, maybe Richard would come back. But each night, sitting alone in the dark, I knew it was only an illusion. I'm not a woman who gives up easily. Over the years, I learned how to be resilient. But as his coldness grew, I realized one-sided sacrifice only drained me. I was still a devoted mother, still a dutiful wife, but I no longer felt like a woman respected by her husband. I tell you this so you understand. Behind my calm smile as I placed that stack of papers on the dinner table was a long road of pain and sacrifice. I had clung on, afraid of loss, but eventually I realized silence and composure might be my strongest weapons. After that tense Christmas dinner, I remained silent. But the truth is, long before that night, I had already sensed the cracks in our marriage. Richard started traveling more. He left with a suitcase on Friday mornings, claiming to attend finance conferences or meet clients, returning late Sunday nights. I wasn't the suspicious type, I had trusted him for years, but the trips became far too frequent. I remember one evening when Ethan asked, "Mom, why is Dad gone so much lately? Is something happening at work?" I forced a smile. "Your dad's just busier than before, that's all." But inside, his question haunted me. Even when Richard was home, his phone never left his hand. Sometimes at midnight, the screen lit up with constant messages. He would leave the bed, step into the hallway, whispering like he didn't want me to hear. I lay still, wide-eyed in the dark, listening to his footsteps fade. When he returned, he spoke in the same rehearsed tone, "A client emergency. Go back to sleep." I turned to the wall, silent. That silence became the mask I wore each day. One afternoon, while sorting papers on my desk, I found a receipt in the bedroom trash can for nearly $5,000 in cash. That expense wasn't part of our budget. I had managed our family finances closely for years, so I knew what was normal and what wasn't. I picked it up, slipped it into a hidden notebook, and from then on, I started keeping records. Another time, Richard left his jacket on the sofa. In the pocket, I found a hotel receipt from Las Vegas. He had told me he was in San Francisco that weekend for a major conference. The bold letters read, "The Grand Mirage Hotel. 2 meals for 2, an expensive bottle of wine and spa services." My heart sank. I sat frozen, then quietly put the receipt back as if I had never seen it. That evening at dinner with Ethan and Grace, I heard Ethan say, "Dad must really love his job. He's always traveling." I forced a smile, cutting the chicken on my plate, unsure what to say. A few weeks later, I found another hotel receipt, this time in Miami. Richard's excuse was meeting potential European clients. I didn't argue, just nodded, my clenched hands turning white. In the dark of my room, I glued the receipt into my notebook. It became a ritual. Every trace I found I kept. Not for immediate revenge, but because I knew one day, I'd need proof. I remember the night Richard came home from a trip, the scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering on his shirt. Not a masculine scent, but a sweet, feminine fragrance. I stood in the laundry room doorway, staring at his shirt. From the living room, I heard him casually ask, "Ethan, how's your startup project going? I'll try to help if you need." His voice sounded so normal, as if nothing was wrong. But to me, it felt like I was living with a stranger. I once dared to ask, "Richard, are you hiding something from me?" He looked at me, a flicker of unease in his eyes before smoothing it over with calm. "You worry too much. I'm just busy." I nodded, but deep inside, I knew the truth wasn't that simple. I chose silence, not because I was weak. I stayed silent because I wanted to protect the children's image of family, at least until they were more grown. I feared the harsh truth would wound them. But I realized the cracks couldn't be hidden forever. Ethan grew more observant, his gaze at his father sharper each day. One evening, when it was just the two of us in the kitchen, he whispered, "Mom, I don't think Dad's just busy with work. There's something else." I froze, then forced a reply. "Don't think too much, Ethan. Focus on your project." But his eyes weighed heavy on my heart. He was old enough to see what I was trying so hard to conceal. Grace was different. She still believed her father only needed time. Once she said, "Mom, Dad will balance things soon. Men sometimes throw themselves into work. I believe he still loves you." I only smiled, stroked her hair, unable to answer. I couldn't shatter her belief, even though the cracks were already too deep. Those days, I lived like a woman with two faces. By day, I was the composed working professional, the smiling mother my kids relied on. But when night fell, I opened my secret notebook, taped in more receipts, recorded more dates, and sometimes tucked in photos of Richard with unfamiliar women I happened to find on social media. Every page was like a dagger but also a shield for the future. There were nights I sat alone on the porch, listening to the wind whistle through the maple trees. I wondered if I was wrong to quietly gather evidence. Should I confront him instead of waiting? But then I remembered Ethan's trusting eyes, Grace's innocent faith. I knew I had to prepare, to stay steady, so when the truth finally came to light, I could protect this family from breaking completely. Richard continued his weekend getaways, still made a habit of slipping out of bed to take calls in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, I quietly collected the puzzle pieces and placed them into the growing notebook. I didn't know when I'd lay it all bare, but I was certain the day would come. And when it did, I wouldn't be the silent woman in the shadows anymore. I'd be the one confronting Richard with truths he never saw coming. One spring afternoon, while I was pruning the roses by the porch, Grace came home from school with a pale face. She walked straight to the kitchen, dropped her backpack on the table, her hands trembling. I knew something was wrong. "Mom." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I saw Dad at the mall today. But he wasn't alone." I set the shears down, wiped my hands on my apron, and sat across from her. "What did you see, Grace?" She took a deep breath, like she needed every ounce of courage to speak. "Dad was with a younger woman. They were holding hands. And there was a little boy, maybe about 7 years old. I think the boy called him Richard." Mom, I couldn't believe my eyes. I was silent for a few seconds. My heart beat, thudded in my ears. But I kept my face steady, refusing to show the shock. I had suspected it. I had quietly logged clues for months. Now Grace's words were the final piece that made the picture whole. "Do you know who she is?" I asked softly. I overheard one of Dad's coworkers mention her name. "Amanda. She works in marketing. I think that's her." Grace lowered her head, her voice cracking. "I had to tell you. I couldn't pretend I didn't see it." I reached out and held her trembling hands. "You did the right thing, Grace. But let me handle this. You don't need to carry this burden for me." She looked up, eyes red. "Aren't you angry? Don't you feel betrayed?" I gave a sad smile. "Of course, sweetheart. But anger won't fix anything. What I need right now is clarity." That night at dinner, Richard sat at the table, as calm as ever. He asked Ethan about his startup, asked Grace how her midterms went. That deep voice I once trusted now sounded like a polished mask. I looked at him and thought about Amanda and the 7-year-old boy. Ethan noticed I was quiet and asked, "Mom, are you okay?" I shook my head and smiled. "Just a little tired." The kids didn't need to know the truth just yet. I wanted to preserve their peace a little longer. As we washed dishes, Grace stood beside me and whispered, "I don't understand why Dad would do this. Isn't our family enough for him?" I wrapped an arm around her and whispered back, "Some things can't be explained right away. But trust me, everything will be clear in time. You just focus on school. Don't let what you saw today hurt you more." Inside me, a fire had been lit. Amanda, this name I had never heard before, was now tied to the strange signs I'd been collecting. I thought back to hotel bills, late-night cash withdrawals, the endless phone calls. All roads pointed to her. A few days later, I came across a photo on social media while scrolling through one of Richard's coworkers' profiles. It was from a small office party, and in the corner of the frame, Richard stood next to a brunette woman, her smile radiant. Next to her was a boy in a plaid shirt, his bright eyes and innocent grin unmistakable. I didn't need to read the caption. That was Amanda. And her son. I zoomed in on the photo. The way Richard looked at her, his eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen in years. I wasn't jealous, but a bitter ache bloomed inside me, as if our years together had become nothing more than an empty shell. That night, when Richard said he had a last-minute meeting, I stayed in the living room, listening to the door close behind him. Grace came downstairs, looking hesitant. "Mom, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have told you. Maybe I just made things worse." I shook my head and pulled her down beside me. "Grace, never apologize for telling the truth. The truth is what helps me see clearly. Without you, I might still be lying to myself." She leaned on my shoulder, tears soaking into my shirt. I gently patted her back, comforting her, and in a way, comforting myself. The next day, I quietly opened my secret notebook, taped in the printed photo. Below it, I wrote, "Confirmed by Grace. Amanda, 32 years old. Son 7. My handwriting was shaky, but my hand no longer hesitated. I knew I had stepped into a quiet war. Richard came home late that night. He slipped into the bedroom, kissed my forehead like always. I lay still, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. But inside, I had never felt more awake. The man lying beside me was no longer the husband I had once trusted. In the days that followed, I maintained a calm front. I still cooked, still went to work, still talked to my children like everything was fine. But with every moment, I watched Richard. I noticed how he smiled when his phone buzzed, how he hurried out the door every weekend. I was no longer the betrayed wife. I was the woman, preparing to face the truth with strength and precision. Grace looked at me with growing concern. One night she asked, "Are you going to talk to Dad?" I replied softly, "Not yet. I need more time." She frowned. "Can you really take it?" I took her hand and whispered, "I endure not because I'm weak, but because I need to be sure. When the truth comes out, there can be no turning back." She hugged me tightly, as if she finally understood my silence was not surrender but preparation for the storm to come. And in that moment, I no longer felt alone. I had my children with me, and I wouldn't let anyone take away what I had built for over 2 decades. That Christmas, our home glowed with lights and the scent of cinnamon. I set the table carefully, smoothing every chair cover, placing my mother's silver-rimmed china at each seat. Ethan brought home a fine bottle of red wine, while Grace chattered about school with the relatives. I stood at the kitchen doorway, taking, in the scene, a peaceful, fragile moment before the storm. Richard arrived last. Still in his tailored dark suit, tie perfectly knotted. He sat at the head of the table, smiling at everyone as though he were still the model husband and father. I watched quietly, seeing now how his smile was just another mask. When the roast turkey was served, Richard suddenly stood. The scraping of his chair on the hardwood floor cut through the room like a sharp blade. The room fell silent. Christmas music still played faintly from the speakers, but every eye turned to him. He raised his glass, glanced around the table, and spoke in a calm, chilling voice. "I have an important announcement. After the holidays, I'll be selling this house. I need the money to start a new life with the woman I truly love." The room froze. My wine glass trembled in my hand. Ethan dropped his fork and knife with a clatter. "What did you just say?" Ethan growled, his face pale with fury. Grace burst into tears, hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking. "Dad, you can't do this. This is our home." Richard didn't even look at the kids. His eyes stared upward as if he were giving a keynote speech. "I've thought it through. Amanda and her son need a stable home. This is my decision." I saw Ethan shoot to his feet, eyes blazing. "Amanda? Are you serious? You're leaving Mom, walking out on this whole family just to chase after some woman you've known for a few months?" Richard frowned and lowered his voice to command. "Sit down, Ethan. You don't understand grown-up matters." "Don't understand." Ethan stepped toward his father, his voice trembling from restraint. "I've seen enough. You disappear constantly, the money's been vanishing. Mom's been struggling to hold everything together. And now you stand here on a holiday no less saying you're going to sell the house. Mom built over decades just to run off with someone else?" Grace burst into sobs. I looked at her, my heart twisting. But instead of yelling or slamming the table like Richard probably expected, I stood slowly. Every pair of eyes turned to me. I stepped away from the table and walked toward my purse by the chair. My hand touched the thick folder I had prepared long ago. I knew this was the moment. I turned back and walked straight up to Richard. "You should take a good look before you say anything else." My voice wasn't loud, but each word echoed through the dead silent room. I placed the folder directly in front of him. The heavy thud of paper hitting the table made everyone jump. Richard stared at it like it was a bomb that could go off any second. He forced a crooked smile, trying to stay calm. "What are you doing, Stella?" I sat back down, calmly buttering a piece of bread, eyes never leaving him. "If you've decided to air your personal life during a family dinner, then I have no reason to keep quiet anymore." Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and disbelief. Grace kept crying, but she lifted her head, her eyes clinging to me, hoping I would do anything to save what was left of our family. Richard hesitated. His fingers tapped the cover of the folder, then pulled back like it was hot to the touch. That confident mask of his cracked into tension. I saw his hand tremble slightly, a rare sign of weakness in a man who always acted unshakable. "You can open it now," I said softly, "or wait until everyone's gone. But remember, truth stays truth, no matter when you choose to face it." The air in the room felt like it had thickened. Relatives sat frozen in silence, no one daring to speak. Only Grace's sniffles, and the faint clink of silverware someone accidentally bumped, broke the stillness. Richard swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward me. Then he forced a smile and tried to dodge. "It's Christmas. This isn't the time for paperwork or business. Let's just enjoy dinner." "No, Dad." Ethan cut in, voice firm. "We're done pretending. If you've got something to say, say it now. If not, open that folder so everyone can see the truth." Richard's face turned red. He gripped his wine glass so tightly I feared it might shatter. Still, he didn't open the folder. Instead, he slid it aside and tried to stay composed. After dinner, Richard muttered awkwardly, "We'll talk privately." I gave a thin smile. "Up to you. But just know I've been ready for this day a long time." The room fell into silence. No more laughter. No more toasts. Christmas dinner, which should have been a time for reunion, had turned into a raw stage where everyone was being forced to face reality. Ethan sat down, still glaring at his father, silently saying he was no longer the naive child who believed every excuse. Grace buried her face in her hands, crying so hard her shoulders shook. I stayed calm, picked up another slice of turkey and chewed. Slowly, like the meal had to go on, like the pain inside had already been layered over with a sheet of ice. The folder lay there, heavy as stone, making the air feel even thicker. Richard didn't dare touch it, but I could see his eyes darting toward it over and over, like an animal cornered, knowing that even a glance could trigger an explosion. I looked at Grace and gently held her hand. "I'm here," I whispered. She looked up, eyes brimming with tears but shining with a flicker of hope. Ethan looked at me too, and gave a slight nod as if saying, "I'm on your side." In the glow of the Christmas lights, it became clear that what Richard just announced wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a betrayal that had been in motion for a long time. But I also knew he had no idea the woman he underestimated had quietly prepared, step by step, so that when this moment came, I wouldn't crumble, I would stand stronger than ever. Richard sat frozen, his hand hovering over the folder, weighing whether to open it. I saw sweat beading on his temple, something I had rarely seen on a man who usually exuded control and arrogance. In that heavy silence, even the ticking clock on the wall sounded piercing. "You should open it, Richard," I said calmly, my tone even and steady. "You're not the only one who knows how to plan ahead." Ethan clenched his fists, eyes locked on his father, while Grace continued to sniffle quietly beside me. A few relatives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they should leave or stay and witness what came next. Richard took a deep breath, and at last, reached out and tore open the seal. The rustling of paper cut through the tension like a blade. Richard flipped through the pages, and I saw the color drain from his face with every line he read. The first page was the property transfer. This house, 3 months ago, had legally been signed over to me. I had quietly worked with a lawyer, finalized the paperwork, stored the records at the bank, just waiting for the day he tried to sell it. His eyes widened in alarm, his hands trembled, and his voice came out hoarse. When did this?" "Long before you thought about selling it to someone else," I interrupted. My tone as casual as if I were commenting on dessert. "You're not the only one who can do math." He bit his lip, then flipped to the next section, photos I had gathered. Richard and Amanda holding hands in Las Vegas, strolling together on a Miami beach, one shot of them exiting a luxury hotel. I heard gasps around the room. Someone let out a shaky breath. Grace covered her mouth, while Ethan gripped his glass so hard his knuckles turned white. "What is this?" Richard choked out. "She's just a coworker. It was a business trip." Ethan let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You really think everyone here is that stupid? What kind of coworker brings her child on a business trip? What kind of coworker clings to your stupid arm like that?" Richard was speechless but still tried to dodge. Ethan, you don't understand how adult relationships work. This isn't your place. Not my place. Ethan shouted, making the whole room jump. You wreck this family, leave mom to suffer alone, make my sister cry herself dry, and you dare say this isn't my place. Richard's face flushed deep red. His eyes darted around the room, but no one was on his side anymore. I could see it, every relative's gaze filled with disappointment, even disgust. He flipped the next page, financial records I had stored. Suspicious cash withdrawals, fancy restaurant bills, and a credit card under both his and Amanda's names. The numbers didn't lie. They were right there, undeniable. I calmly poured more water into Grace's glass and said gently, "Drink, sweetheart, don't let yourself go thirsty." Then I turned to offer seconds to a few relatives as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Richard slammed the folder shut, trying to regain control. "Stella, are you doing this in front of everyone just to humiliate me?" I looked him straight in the eyes, the smile still on my face. "No, Richard. You humiliated yourself. I simply showed the truth." Grace burst into tears, burying her face into my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around my daughter and gently comforted her. Ethan looked at his father with a coldness I had never seen before. "You betrayed Mom. You betrayed us. Do you really think we'd still call someone like you, Dad?" Richard stammered, "Ethan, you can't say that. No matter what, I'm still your what?" Ethan cut in. "The kind of father who leaves his family for another woman. The kind who tries to sell the house Mom built just to please his mistress? If that's your idea of a father, then sorry I don't have one." The room fell into heavy silence. A few relatives coughed awkwardly, but no one spoke up to defend Richard. They all looked at me, as if waiting for some kind of direction. I remained calm, picked up my wine glass, took a sip and set it down lightly. "Let's keep eating. The turkey's still warm." My words stunned everyone. But then, strangely enough, a few people slowly picked up their forks and knives, quietly continuing their meals. Ethan stayed silent, his angry eyes fixed on his father. Grace sat beside me, her eyes red and puffy. Richard sat frozen, the folder lying open in front of him like an indictment he couldn't deny. He started to rise from his chair but then sank back down, as if his legs could no longer hold him up. His face had gone pale, his hands clenched tightly together. I saw a version of Richard I had never seen before, small, panicked, and completely powerless. I turned and smiled at the aunt sitting next to me. "Would you like more mashed potatoes? I made them using Grandma's recipe. I'm sure you remember it." My aunt nodded, trying to hide her discomfort. I stood, scooped more onto her plate, and calmly returned to my seat. Richard stared at me, his eyes filled with both anger and helplessness. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to argue. With just a few pieces of paper and absolute silence, I had stripped him of every ounce of power right there at the Christmas table. In my mind, one thought rang clear. For years, I had been dismissed, ignored, and underestimated in my own home. But in this moment, for the first time in a very long time, I finally felt in control. Richard forced himself to speak, his voice shaking. "Stella, what do you want?" I set down my silverware and looked at him with steady eyes. "It's not about what I want, Richard. You chose this path. I simply prepared so I wouldn't get dragged down with you." He lowered his head and said nothing. The folder remained on the table, bearing witness to everything I had quietly endured and collected. I kept eating, kept chatting with the others, as if dinner was still just dinner. But deep down, I knew everything had changed from this point on. I sat quietly through the rest of Christmas dinner, watching Richard's face shift by the minute, while inside me rose a feeling both painful and unshakable. He had no idea that everything laid bare in front of him wasn't the product of sudden rage, but the result of months of silent preparation. It all began on a summer morning, when I sat on the porch sipping coffee. Sunlight streamed through the fiery red maple trees, but my heart felt frozen. The night before, Richard hadn't come home, claiming it was a business trip. That morning, I found a receipt tucked in his suit pocket for a very expensive piece of jewelry. The store description said it was a diamond necklace worth more than a full month of my salary. It wasn't for me. I had never received anything like that. I remember my hands trembling, but instead of crying, I snapped a photo of the receipt and put it into a secret notebook. That night, I couldn't sleep. A single thought kept echoing. I couldn't keep living in this lie. I had to prepare. The next day during lunch break, I scheduled a meeting with attorney Mark Harris. He was well known around Seattle for handling high-profile divorces and asset divisions, a man who had made seasoned executives back down. I remember his office was on the 14th floor of a sleek glass building, elegant but cold. When I walked in, Mark stood and shook my hand. His voice was warm but sharp. "Mrs. Davidson, I've read your email. We have a lot to cover." I sat down, my heart racing, but my voice stayed steady. "I need a plan to protect myself and my children. I won't let my husband destroy everything I've built." Mark flipped through the folder I'd brought: hotel bills, social media photos, jewelry receipts. He nodded. "You've done well documenting everything. That'll be a major advantage. The first thing you need to do is separate your assets. Open a private account. Start moving anything you can legally transfer." I left his office that day with a long list. I went to the bank and opened an account in my name only, so discreetly that not even Ethan or Grace knew. I began transferring small amounts, nothing that would raise Richard's suspicion, but enough to add up. My bonuses, my share of the savings, even minor investments under my name, all went into that new safe place. Every new dollar in that account felt like armor I was putting on. But Mark also gave me another piece of advice. In these cases, image evidence and witnesses are everything. If you suspect he's having a relationship with that woman, hire a private investigator. Don't rely on emotions. I followed his advice. A few weeks later, I met with a man named Daniel, a former police officer turned private investigator. He was quiet, careful, and professional. I asked him to track Richard's questionable business trips. Within 2 weeks, Daniel brought me a thick envelope, photos of Richard and Amanda walking hand in hand through the streets of Miami, Richard carrying a 7-year-old boy on his shoulders, and a series of shots of them leaving a luxury resort. I looked at every photo, my chest tightening like a fist was squeezing my heart. The man who once vowed to stand beside me for life now smiled with another woman, another child, as if he were the devoted husband and father he never was at home. But I didn't cry. I quietly noted the dates, locations, and filed them all into the safe. Mark reviewed the photos and nodded. "Perfect, this is what we needed." Then he looked me straight in the eye, his voice hard. "You need to be ready. Men like Richard always think they're in control. They'll never see it coming when you outmaneuver them." Around that time, I discovered Richard was making plans to buy a new house. I stumbled across the email because he forgot to log out on our home computer. In a message to Amanda, he promised, "Once we sell the current place, we'll put a deposit on the Westfield villa. You and your son will have your own rooms, a big yard, and good schools nearby." I sat frozen in front of the screen. That house, the one I had poured years of my life into, was just a down payment for someone else's dream. I printed the email and tucked it neatly into the file. Every evening when Richard wasn't home, I would sit in the living room, open the file, review everything, then close it again. I didn't want to be a suspicious wife. But I knew this was the only way to protect myself and my children. One night, Grace came downstairs unexpectedly and saw me writing. She asked, "Mom, what are you doing?" I quickly closed the notebook and smiled. "Just writing down some work notes, sweetie." She believed me instantly and didn't ask more. Looking into her innocent eyes only made me more determined to stay strong. Ethan was different. He was older, more perceptive. One day, after I returned from the bank, he squinted and asked, "Mom, are you getting ready for something?" I placed my hand on his shoulder and answered softly, "There are things I can't explain just yet. But trust me, I'm doing the right thing." He nodded silently, squeezing my hand as if to say he'd always be on my side. Those months I lived like two different people. By day, I was still the devoted wife and mother, still smiling beside Richard when necessary. But by night, I became a cold, focused woman, sitting at my desk, collecting every piece of evidence, calculating every move. Each detail I gathered was like a brick by brick. I built a wall of protection around myself. I knew Richard thought I was submissive. He believed I would stay silent forever, would accept being left behind while he built a new life with Amanda. But he had no idea that all those days and nights I had been quietly turning pain into strength, betrayal into motivation. And then came Christmas. When Richard proudly stood up and declared he would sell the house, I was ready. That folder hadn't been prepared overnight. It was the result of a long, silent journey I had walked alone. A road full of tears, but also filled with determination. Looking back on that moment, I realized, sometimes preparation isn't just about protecting your assets. It's about protecting your own self-respect. I was no longer the quiet woman standing in the background. I had become the one rewriting her own story with sharp silence and undeniable truth. Richard left the house just 2 days after that Christmas party. I remember that morning clearly, the sound of tires crunching over gravel at the gate, the thud of suitcases against the trunk. He didn't say a word to me. He only looked at Ethan and Grace with a mix of anger and wounded pride. Then the cars sped off, leaving behind a cold, empty driveway. News of Richard moving out spread quickly among relatives and friends. Not long after, I heard he had rented a luxury apartment downtown where bright lights covered every balcony, where he could fool himself into believing it was a fresh start. Amanda and her son moved in with him. Just the thought of Richard placing his hand on that boy's shoulder while ignoring his own children made bitterness rise in my throat. But I didn't cry. I wouldn't let myself be weak. Instead, I gave all my focus to Ethan and Grace. I knew Richard wouldn't stop at just leaving. Sure enough, a few days later, he began calling the kids. His voice echoed through the speakerphone. I heard every word. "Ethan, you have to understand, your mother's being selfish. She's keeping all the assets and stopping me from building a new life. I just want to be happy, to take care of Amanda and the boy. Why are you taking her side?" Ethan stayed quiet, then simply replied, "I don't see it that way." Richard turned to Grace. One afternoon, when picking her up for lunch, he sat in the car and whispered, "Grace, you're my daughter. You know me better than anyone. Your mom never knows how to compromise. Look what she did, she embarrassed me in front of the whole family. Do you really think a woman like that cares about this family?" Grace got out of the car and slammed the door shut without saying a word. That night, she sat silently in her room, her eyes red. I walked in and placed my hand on her shoulder. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Grace hesitated, then sighed. "Dad says you're selfish. But I don't believe him. I just think he's changed too much." I pulled her into my arms and whispered, "Sweetheart, the truth isn't always said out loud. There are things I haven't wanted you and Ethan to see. But one day, you'll understand what's real and what's not." I didn't expect that answer to come so soon. A week later, Grace came running into the living room, pale-faced, holding Richard's laptop. He had left it in the garage storage. "Mom, I accidentally opened one of his old email folders. I didn't understand everything, but you need to see this." I opened it. On the screen were clear email exchanges between Richard and one of his company employees. The content showed secret fund transfers from a project account into a personal account. Then, from that account, the money had been moved to Amanda's credit card. The amount wasn't small, hundreds of thousands of dollars in less than 6 months. Grace stood beside me, her voice trembling. Dad used company money to support her. "Mom, what happens if this gets found out?" I gently held her hand, looking her straight in the eye. "This is the truth I've been waiting for. See, the things your father said to you and Ethan, those were just ways to hide what he was really doing. You don't have to be confused anymore. Everything will come to light." Ethan heard the news and rushed downstairs, his eyes burning with anger. "He didn't just betray you, he betrayed the company and everyone who trusted him. Mom, we can't let this go." I looked at both of them, feeling a mix of pain and relief. Pain because of the harsh truth, but relief because my children could now see their father for who he really was. I knew that from this moment on, Richard could no longer manipulate or deceive them. That night, I sat alone in the living room and printed out every email, compiling them into folders. The hum of the printer echoed like a steady heartbeat. Each sheet that fell into the tray was undeniable proof. I placed them carefully into a leather case and locked it inside the steel drawer. In the dark, I heard the wind howling outside the window and shivered slightly. I knew Richard wouldn't go down without a fight. He was the kind of man who, when cornered, would strike back hard. But this time, I had something he couldn't deny. The next morning, when Grace woke up, she quietly said, "Mom, I had a dream that Dad called and cried, apologizing. But when I woke up, I remembered he's never cried for us, has he?" I hugged her, feeling her small shoulders tremble. "That's right, Grace. But you don't need dreams anymore. Just live honestly and stay strong. One day, you'll see every truth has a price." In the days that followed, Richard kept calling, still trying to plant the idea in their minds that I was cruel. But when I looked into Ethan and Grace's eyes, I knew he had lost. The truth was on our side now, and step by step, it would expose everything. I'll never forget the day I walked into Richard's company headquarters. It marked a turning point in my life. That tall, sleek building, once the place he proudly brought me to during annual galas, had now become the place where I would drop the bombshell of truth. In my hand was the leather case packed with undeniable evidence: emails, account statements, wire transfers, even photos of Richard vacationing with Amanda paid for by company funds. I walked slowly, each step heavy but full of purpose. I was escorted into the boardroom. Familiar faces of shareholders, the same people who once shook Richard's hand and called him a pillar, now looked at me with curiosity and surprise. Attorney Harris stood beside me, carefully placed the case on the table, and gave me a small nod. I opened it and laid out the documents across the polished surface. The room fell quiet. The finance director frowned, flipped through the statements, then slammed them down. Over $300,000. Gone in 6 months. What kind of joke is this? I sat upright, my gaze calm. This isn't a joke. It's the truth. That money was withdrawn by Richard using his approval rights, then funneled into a personal account, and from there used to cover bills, travel, and personal expenses for a woman named Amanda. A wave of murmurs rippled across the Feasons table. An older shareholder shook his head in disappointment. "I trusted him for over 10 years. I can't believe this." The board chairman looked around, his voice firm. "If this evidence is verified, Richard didn't just break company policy, he could face criminal charges." I slid a folder of photos across the table. In them, Richard and Amanda were arm in arm at a luxury resort, with hotel bills paid using the company credit card. A heavy silence settled over the room. Within 48 hours of that meeting, a suspension notice was sent across the entire company. My phone rang nonstop that day. Richard screamed into the receiver, "Are you insane, Stella? You trying to destroy me? You think humiliating me in front of the board means you've won?" I calmly replied, "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone. I'm just bringing the truth to light. What you did, you have to own it." On the other end, Richard's breath came fast and shallow, like he couldn't believe I had gone this far. But that wasn't even the biggest shock to him. Amanda, the woman Richard had pinned all his hopes on, finally revealed her true colors. When she found out Richard had been suspended, she completely lost her sweet facade. That evening, neighbors said they could hear their shouting echoing down the hallway of the luxury apartment. Amanda screamed, "You promised me a mansion. You said you'd give me a rich life. And now it was all just talk." "Ah." Richard growled, "It's only temporary. I'll figure something out. You have to trust me." But Amanda laughed bitterly. "Trust you? You couldn't even hold on to your job. You really thought I didn't know you stole money from the company? You thought you could hide it forever?" And in the middle of that chaos, another secret came out. Amanda had never really cut ties with her ex-husband. In fact, while living with Richard, she had still been secretly in contact with him, collecting child support money. The messages, the bank receipts, they were all revealed by an acquaintance who accidentally showed them to Grace when she started digging to find out more about this woman. Grace brought the information home, placed the phone on the table, and said with a trembling but firm voice, "Mom, I found this. Amanda's still getting money from her ex. Dad doesn't know. She's just using him." I looked at my daughter, my heart aching with pride and sorrow. "You've really grown up, Grace. You've seen who they truly are. Don't worry, the truth will reach your father soon." Sure enough, it didn't take long. One morning, Richard called me, his voice full of bitterness. "Stella, did you know? Amanda betrayed me. I left my family, I left the company, and she was still sneaking around getting money from her ex. Are you satisfied now? I was silent for a few seconds before answering in a steady voice. I'm not satisfied, Richard. I'm sad. Sad that you gave up everything that truly mattered for an illusion. But you chose this. On the other end, he exhaled heavily, as if something inside him had completely broken. I ended the call without another word. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I knew that any comfort would be meaningless. Richard had gone too far, and now he had to face the consequences of his own actions. In the days that followed, I focused on taking care of Ethan and Grace, doing my best to protect them from the storm. But I didn't stop watching the news about Richard. I knew the fight wasn't over. He might still try something. But for now, the scales had tipped in my favor. I was no longer the silent wife. I had become a witness to the truth and the one holding the balance for this family. The news of Amanda leaving came to me in a short phone call from one of Richard's old friends. Just a few sentences. She cleared out everything. Took all the expensive gifts he bought her and disappeared without a trace. I froze for a moment. Not out of surprise, but because it was exactly what I expected. A woman who only values material things was never going to stick around once the man lost his power. Richard was in free fall. After the suspension, the company swiftly completed its internal investigation. The evidence I submitted opened up a rotten nest: fake invoices, circular wire transfers, personal expenses disguised as business ones. The board of directors had no choice but to file a lawsuit. The day he was served with a court summons, Richard called me in panic. His voice was hoarse. "Stella, please help me. I'm going to lose everything. They're saying I could get probation, have to pay back an enormous amount of money. I can't live like this." I stayed silent for a few seconds, swallowing the bitter memories he had left behind. "Richard, you chose this path. I warned you. I gave you chances to stop. But you ignored them. And now, no one can undo the consequences." He choked out. At least let me see the kids. I need them." I replied in a calm but firm voice. "Ethan and Grace aren't Lucky Charms you can cling to when things fall apart. They're your children, but also fragile souls. If you truly loved them, you wouldn't drag them into this mess." The phone went quiet after that. And I knew from that moment on he was truly alone. Ethan and Grace heard bits and pieces about their father's situation through school gossip and social media. One evening, as I was finishing up dinner, Grace hesitantly asked, "Mom, Dad called me a few times." I didn't pick up. Did I do something wrong? I sat down beside her and held her small hand. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. You have the right to protect yourself from things that hurt. Your dad is paying the price for what he's done. You don't have to carry that burden for him." Ethan, sitting across the table, stayed silent for a long while before saying, "I got a message too. But I didn't want to hear it. I'm tired, Mom. Tired of how he always picked someone else over this family. I'm on your side this time." His words made my eyes sting. I had never taught my kids to hate their father, but they had seen the truth and made their own choices. I just nodded gently and whispered, "I know. And thank you." The trial took place a few months later. I sat in the plaintiff's section beside Attorney Harris. Richard appeared looking worn down, his suit no longer crisp, his presence dimmed. Every now and then, he glanced at me, silently pleading for mercy, but I only met him with composure. The prosecutor laid out a mountain of evidence: unauthorized withdrawals, forged statements, testimonies from the accountant he pressured into signing off on documents. Every detail hit like a hammer, leaving Richard no room to deny it. His defense attorney had no strategy left but to plead for leniency, blaming Richard's downfall on misplaced trust and poor financial judgment. But the court wasn't swayed. When the judge announced the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Richard was convicted of financial fraud, sentenced to probation, and ordered to repay the entire amount he had stolen. It was a crushing blow to a man who once stood at the head of boardrooms, now branded a fraud. I didn't clap. I didn't feel triumphant. I just closed my eyes for a brief moment, releasing a burden that had weighed on me for far too long. Justice had done its part. Now all that remained was my responsibility to protect my family. As for me, the divorce and asset division case finally reached its conclusion. With clear evidence of Richard's betrayal and misconduct, the court ruled in my favor. I was granted full ownership of the house and the majority of shared assets. Ethan and Grace were officially placed in my custody, with no further dispute. I remember the day we returned home after the final hearing. The afternoon sun bathed the walls in golden light. Grace wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "Mom, we're really safe now, aren't we?" I brushed her hair back, smiling through tears. "Yes, sweetheart. We're truly safe now." Ethan didn't say anything. He just held my shoulder tightly, a quiet promise that he'd always be there. I stood in that house, taking in the windows, the stairs, the familiar walls. And for the first time I felt something new. This wasn't just the house of our past. It was the beginning of a new life. A life with no Richard. No more betrayal. No more torment. And above all, I knew I hadn't just won a court battle. I had reclaimed respect for myself, and peace for my children. 1 year passed faster than I expected. The house that once held so many bitter memories had taken on a whole new look. The kids and I renovated each room, replacing worn-out walls with fresh coats of paint, and widening the windows so sunlight could pour in every morning. The backyard, once overrun with weeds, became a garden filled with roses, hydrangeas, and a few bushes of deep purple lavender. But what I was most proud of wasn't the transformation of the house, it was the room on the ground floor that I turned into a community reading space. I bought some simple wooden shelves and filled them with hundreds of books that the kids and I had collected over the years. A small sign hung by the door read, "Free reading room. Everyone welcome." On opening day, only a few curious neighborhood kids dropped by. They stepped in hesitantly, then ended up reading for hours, forgetting all about the time. Gradually, word spread around the neighborhood. Every afternoon after school, the room filled with laughter, the flipping of pages, and sometimes lively debates among the kids. I would sit by the window, make tea, and watch them like I was seeing my own childhood, one that lacked support, but now I had the chance to give back to the next generation. Ethan had also started walking his own path. My son had been nurturing an idea to launch a clean energy tech startup. I remember the nights he stayed up late, hunched over his computer, drafting his business plan and asking me, "Mom, what do you think about raising funds from small investors instead of big firms? I want to prove myself before asking for help from anyone else." I looked into his determined eyes, feeling both anxious and proud. I withdrew part of my savings to support him and told him, "Ethan, I believe in you. But more importantly, you need to believe in yourself. Success comes from patience and integrity, not shortcuts." A year later, Ethan's small company unexpectedly received a major order from an environmental organization. My son hugged me tightly, eyes shining, and said, "Mom, we did it." I smiled, tears falling onto his shoulder, not because of money, but because I saw he had truly grown up, building his life with his own hands. Grace chose a different path. She had always loved justice, maybe shaped by everything our family had gone through. The day she received her Harvard Law acceptance letter, she burst into the kitchen waving the paper above her head. "Mom, I got in. I'm going to be a lawyer to defend those without a voice." I held her close, feeling her little heart racing with dreams. I smiled, "Grace, you'll do it. And I'll always be right behind you." It seemed like everything had settled. But life always finds a way to test us again. At Grace's high school graduation, with the campus filled with flowers and applause, I suddenly spotted Richard. He stood at the far end of the seating area, thinner now, with streaks of gray in his hair. As Grace stepped on stage to receive her diploma, his eyes followed her with a regret he couldn't hide. After the ceremony, as students and parents poured into the schoolyard, Richard walked toward us. His voice was low. "Grace, I'm proud of you. I'm sorry for everything. Is there any way we can start over?" Grace looked at him with a calm face, like a still lake. She didn't cry, didn't smile. She just nodded slightly and said, "Thank you for coming." Then she turned to take my hand and walked away without looking back. That was the first time I saw my daughter truly grown, polite enough to be respectful, but strong enough not to be pulled back into the same old cycle. Richard stood still, his hand reaching into empty air. For a moment, I saw in his eyes an endless void, like a man finally realizing that the most precious things in life had slipped through his fingers. But I didn't go to him. I knew some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. That evening, as we sat together on the porch, the sunset painting the trees in golden light, I let the breeze kiss my face. Ethan talked about his new project. Grace excitedly shared about the upcoming classes at Harvard. I listened heart full, of a peace I hadn't known in years. Looking toward the fading sky, I whispered to myself, sometimes losing a betrayer is the only way to find yourself. In that moment, I was no longer the woman who had cried herself empty over betrayal. I was a mother, a woman who had risen from the wreckage, a soul that had found its light after years in the dark. And to me that was the true beginning of life. That's the journey I've walked, from a broken home to a life reborn in light. But every time I tell it, I still wonder, if it were you, and Richard showed up at Grace's graduation, what would you have done? Would you forgive, or would you nod politely and walk away like my daughter did? Everyone has their limit, and everyone finds peace in their own way. For me, the biggest lesson was this: no one gets to decide your worth but you. Betrayal can take many things from you, but it can also become the torch that lights the path to your inner strength. What do you think about my story? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts, because sometimes it's the perspective of an outsider that helps us see more clearly. And if you'd like to stay with me a little longer to hear more stories about family, love, betrayal, and healing, follow the channel. Who knows? In one of these stories, you just might catch a glimpse of your own life.